The next guest, Molly Scott Cato, is a professor of strategy and sustainability at Roehampton University and has worked for several years as a green economist. Her latest book, The Bioregional Economy, Land, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. She presents ideas for a new model of stable and sustainable economic life. In 2009, she published Green Economics, an introduction to theory, policy, and practice. And she has also written widely on themes concerned with mutualism, social enterprise, policy responses to climate change, banking and finance, and local economies. Molly is an active member of the Green Party, the party's national speaker on economics, and leader of the Green Group on Stroud District Council. She works with Transition Stroud and was involved in the launch of a local currency in Stroud in 2009. She is also a director of Stroud Commonwealth. So, welcome here. Please.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Am I speaking in the right place? Are you picking that up?
Are.
Yeah, good. Excellent. Good. Many points of view. I'd just like to start by saying that I agree with absolutely everything that Thomas said, and it was very interesting, because I'm going to talk a little bit at a tangent to the main focus of the conference here. And what I'm going to do actually is kind of address the environmental aspects of the question of inequality, because I think that's probably a useful role for me. That's not to say I don't agree with the land aspects, because I do, and you'll see how they relate to what I'm saying, I hope, as I go along. But I think that's a useful role for me to play here. So when we come back to the question of in what sense is land free, I think in the economic sense, in the ownership sense that Thomas was identifying, I think it absolutely is free. But I'm not sure it is free in the free speech kind of sense, because that would mean that you have complete license to do as you will with it. And you'll see that some of the freedoms that I'm seeking to curtail are to do with the way we use land and the environmental consequences of uncontrolled use of land. Okay, so I've got three parts to what I'm going to say. I'm going to start out with something that actually addresses the theme of this conference in terms of conscious evolution, which I was very pleased to see that was one of the labels, because it's something I've been thinking about as well. Then I'm going to think about inequality and what that has to do with sustainability. And then I'm going to move on to think about a fair shares economy and a cooperative economy. Okay, so it's a fairly sort of commonplace thing to say in the green movement that we're going to be the first species that is able to monitor our own extinction. And consecutive reports from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel. Oh, let's move on. Sorry, this is my inspiring slide. This is where I'm going. When I was saying where I'm going, this is where we should have been. But we can just stay with this slide because I don't need the next slide for a while. So, yeah, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change produces consecutive reports, and they suggest that we may well be right about this. But I try to be a bit more optimistic about the future. And so my optimism organises itself under a little mantra, which is join the evolution. And this is how Join the Evolution works. As human beings, we're a unique kind of animal, a self-conscious animal. When other animals receive indications that they're reaching the limits of their evolutionary niche, they respond to these indications by finding a new niche, or by failing to reproduce, or otherwise by ensuring that their numbers decline, eating their own offspring or something horrible like that. But as humans, we're much too clever for that. We can use our clever minds and our technology to keep pushing the boundary outwards, ignoring and filtering out the clear evidence that the ecological safety limits have been reached and exceeded, in fact. So as a self-conscious animal, we need to evolve self-consciously. We need to find a way to get a grip on ourselves as a collectivity and to stop believing our own fantasies, to get back down to earth. And this is where what I'm saying relates very closely to the land-based work that you all do. This is what I mean by joining the evolution, and I would argue that it's a desire to do something like this that is driving a lot of us in this room today, to be able to consciously address the ecological and social crisis that we're facing. So I've got a lot of time for science, and I'm glad this is called the School of Economic Science, but I don't think that science is going to save us. And in fact, I think one of the problems is that we're trapped in a kind of scientistic mindset, and that's particularly true of neoclassical economics. So science won't save us. We need much more human solutions to do that. And I'd just like to finish this introductory section with a quotation from Hazel Henderson, who referred to conventional economists as suffering from physics envy, from trying to portray the world as a system of scientific laws akin to the laws of physics. In order to achieve this, they need to define out of existence the complex social and spiritual creatures that actually inhabit the planet, and reduce human beings to rational economic men. I'll come back to Hazel Henderson in a while, because I think she's a very useful economist, and she's got useful things to say about an economy based on sharing as well. So now I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about sustainability and equity and what they have, how they're related to each other. So I was travelling in Brazil earlier in the year, and I was really horrified to find myself being shunned by young people, and exactly the sorts of young people I hoped I might be able to inspire. But what had happened was, following the Rio +20 conference, they had begun to associate the phrase green economy with an exploitative post-colonial kind of process. So when I said I was a green economist, they all decided they weren't going to come to my presentation. It was a bit of a shame, because actually I had quite a lot to say to them. Anyway, the few who did come said, we're going to go and tell the rest what you're really up to. But it was quite interesting to me that that's what green economy means in the context of Brazil. So their environments, they were arguing, were being sold so that we could continue to enjoy our energy-intensive lifestyles. Actually, that was exactly what I was arguing, but never mind. So since we need to engage all the world's people in creating a sustainable future, this was of great concern to me. And I want to spend a bit of time thinking about that link between sustainability and equity. Right, need a slide now. So from the perspective of the South, I've listed some of the ways that the environmental crisis is being used to increase inequality. I don't know if you spotted this, but in 2012, McKinsey Consultancy published an important report called Resource Revolution. Now, to me, that was a sign that there was a legal battle at foot for the ownership of the world's land. If you know anything about neoclassical economics, you know that this isn't an issue, because neoclassical economics, while at the same time arguing that it's based around scarcity, because without scarcity you can't have a price, so you can't have a market, simultaneously argues that actually there isn't a problem with scarcity, because if something runs out, you immediately find a substitute. Now, that's been the argument I've been struggling with for a long number of years. The publication of the McKinsey report marks an end to that argument. So this is where I see that those who seek to control the world's land have decided they can no longer argue that way, and they're now having to find ways to control the remaining resources. So if you haven't read it if you can bear to go to the McKinsey website at all. The report considers that ongoing change in global land ownership patterns and land use is what they call the next revolution, the next agro-industrial revolution. The West is concerned about preserving their lifestyle, their high-energy lifestyle, I agree, and need a piece of land, large areas of land, to use as a sink for our emissions from our energy-intensive lifestyle. The first phase of this was the Clean Development Mechanism, which was agreed in Kyoto, essentially renting or buying pieces of land in other people's countries to put trees there so you can carry on flying. Very small summary. But the land has also been seized to produce biofuels to substitute for fossil fuels. The campaign group Grano estimate that 17 million hectares of land has been captured by global agribusiness to produce fuel crops between 2002 and 2012. Much of this land is in some of the world's poorest countries, and it's been diverted to the production of subsistence. It's been diverted away from the production of subsistence crops for local people and into the production of energy crops for our benefit, essentially. One of the most disturbing features of our political economy over the past several decades has been the widening distance between rich and poor, and that's one of the themes I was asked to address here. So I see this as a major, I need the next slide now, I see this as the major political achievement of the interests of capital over the course of my lifetime, and it's illustrated in this next slide here. So I was born more or less when you finished your education, I think, down in 1963. And actually, as I was growing up as a child, it was, I didn't realise this, wish I'd enjoyed it at the time, but it was the kind of heyday of the power of workers and people over the power of capital. And you can see this clearly in this slide here. 1976 is a very interesting year because it's also the year that if you take a way of measuring the economy in terms of genuine welfare, the genuine progress indicator, it also comes to a maximum at that point. Although if you remember British history, 1976 and 77 were extraordinary years of 3-day week and sitting there with your candle, and, which actually was quite a laugh, but didn't seem like much of an economic success at the time. Anyway, here's the graph of inequality, the share of total income going to the richest 1% of people. You can see it hit a low point in 1976. And my interpretation is at that point the interests of capital started to really take fright and basically start the fight back. And you can see how successful they've been. And the success, I think the sort of policies they lobbied for and the sort of way they influenced how economists look at the world is the reason for the acceleration that Thomas was talking about. And it's kind of got completely out of control now, but nobody can see a way to reverse that process. So this inequality is the most serious political problem of the age of austerity. Because when an economy is expanding, politicians can keep everybody happy by offering them higher consumption, even though they may always have relatively less than those at the top of the pyramid. So you might have less than your neighbour, but you've got more than you had last year. So that's what politicians offer you to keep you happy. Now that the economy stopped growing, those below the top echelons are seeing their material wealth shrink, while they witness continuing wealth accumulation among the richest in society. There's loads of evidence of this. I mean, Thomas showed some as well. OECD economists find that annual average income in the UK of the top 10% in 2008 was just under 55,000, about 12 times higher than that of the bottom 10%, who had an average income of just 4,700. This is up from a ratio of 8 to 1 in 1985, and significantly higher than the income gap in developed nations, which is 9 to 1. So anyway, I won't go on with any more data of that, because let's move on to something about how that relates to sustainability. The increasing spending power of the wealthy, right, there we are. The increasing spending power of the very wealthy is environmentally problematic, since the research shows that they're disproportionately responsible for carbon emissions. This is a great piece of work which was done by Eldin Farmi and his team at the School of Policy Studies in Bristol and funded by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation.
You can't read the...
No, don't worry, I'll go through it. Using a dataset comprising 24,207 private households drawn from the Expenditure and Food Survey and additional data from House Condition Survey, Passenger Survey and Travel Surveys, they put all those surveys together to try to analyse how much carbon dioxide people put out according to their income group. So what the graph's showing you, it's really poor, isn't it? I can read it down here. But anyway, it's basically income groups from the poorest 10% to the richest 10%. So they're income deciles. And it's showing you how much carbon dioxide they produce for a range of different uses of fossil fuel. So this one here is aviation, the bottom one, the dark blue one. And what's the punchline in terms of aviation? I've got the number here somewhere. I think it's, the richest 10% produce 6 times more aviation-related carbon dioxide emissions than the poorest 10%. And the only category of emissions that the poorest 10% produce more is room heating, and that's because they have really appalling quality houses that they have to keep warm in the winter.
Excuse me, Ma, is this UK?
This is UK, yeah, UK data. So because the global economy relies on fossil fuels for production and consumption, our material wealth is closely related to our production of carbon emissions. And this is shown on the next slide, which takes a global perspective. And this is from Tim Jackson's work, which he produced a few years ago. And what he did was he produced scenarios that analysed the carbon efficiency of production under a range of different assumptions. So what he's doing here, the left-hand axis here, is showing you the carbon intensity of production, and that's measured in terms of grams of carbon dioxide per $1 of output. So how cheaply or expensively can you produce stuff that can be sold in a market? That's basically the question that lies behind the graphic here. So he moves from when he did the research, much better, yeah. He moves from when he did the research in 2007. On a world basis, it took 768 grams of carbon dioxide to produce $1 worth of output. In the UK, we were more efficient in energy terms, and Japan was even more efficient in energy terms. But what he does then is to look forward and to make a number of assumptions. So, for example, let's take scenario 3. In scenario 3, he assumes that by 2050, the world population will be 9 billion people. So what he asks is, how much do we have to improve our energy efficiency of production to be able to enable all those 9 billion people to have the same lifestyle that we enjoy in the EU by 2050? And what he finds in his scenario 3 is that we need to move from 768 grams of carbon dioxide per dollar's worth of output all the way to 14. And that's, I think, a 128-fold increase in our efficiency. So if there's any engineers in the audience, I would hope you would agree with me that's completely unfeasible efficiency improvement by 2050. If that's the case, then what we need to do is change our lifestyles, radically and rapidly reduce the amount of energy that we're actually producing. And so the other point... Using. Well, okay, anyway, we'll debate that later. Yeah, that's fine. So this is a point about equity. This isn't just a point about equality, because what we do when we produce more carbon dioxide is we use the land of the developing world to absorb some of that carbon dioxide. That's why I started with the clean development mechanism. Or we find other ways of producing energy using biofuels that again use land that actually we need for food production. Okay, so let's move on to think about the cooperative economy and why I think that's important. Well, there are obviously political and social reasons why inequality matters. And personally, I see the rise in support for far-right parties across Europe as a clear warning of the consequences of this inequality, the growing inequality. But there are also sustainability reasons why we need to share the world's resources more fairly. And here I'm going to actually quote Hazel Henderson, who argued, and here's the quote, "An economy based on renewable resources, carefully managed for sustained yield and long-term productivity of all its resources, can provide useful, satisfying work and richly rewarding lifestyles for all its participants. However, it simply cannot provide support for enormous pyramided capital structures and huge overheads, large pay differentials, windfall returns on investments, and capital gains to investors." So this is why a strand of my research for several years now has been on the cooperative economy. It offers an opportunity to achieve equality and sustainability simultaneously, and the Danish wind power revolution offers us a really terrific example of that. In Denmark, the government has used policies to build up one of the biggest renewable energy sectors in the world, now representing 20,000 jobs, and actually Denmark also has 50% of the world market in wind turbine manufacture. The slide illustrates the impressive growth in wind power generation in Denmark between 1986 and 2009. You can also see, incidentally, how effective policy is. We hear so much from politicians saying, oh, there's nothing I can do, kind of the myth of powerlessness. Here's a government wanting to do something, introduce the right incentives, strong feed-in tariff, especially for community-owned wind turbines, and you can see the difference. Actually, Conservative government elected towards the end of this period reversed the tariff and turbines start to come down. This is all research that was done by Andy Cumbers of Glasgow University. Although there was actually no fetishism about ownership type in the Danish case, the direct economic and energy advantages enjoyed by local people avoided the kind of community opposition that we've seen in this country. Government invested heavily, offering a subsidy of 30% on all new wind power investment between 1980 and 1990 to get the thing started. It offered a high and consistent rate of feed-in tariff, representing 84% of the costs of generation from 1993 onwards. Its support for community ownership led to 84% of wind farms being cooperatively owned and 12% of the population of Denmark having a share in a wind farm. The next slide actually shows, that was just that data, sorry. The next slide shows the plurality of ownership forms, which is one of the examples for the extraordinary success of this sector in Denmark. So you can see that there are various combinations. There's some that's municipally owned, there's some that's owned by a combination of local government and local cooperatives, there's some that's just owned by cooperatives themselves. And we see a similar expansion of cooperative ownership of wind power in Germany. You've probably heard about some of the amazing energy villages where people are now growing rich within the village, although I don't know how far it extends, on the basis of their renewable generation that they export to neighbouring villages. So I just use this partly to challenge the mantra that seems pervasive, although it's only really made true by constant repetition, that only private profit-driven business can save our economy. I think that's one of the assumptions that's actually holding us back. Okay, so the last bit of the presentation is actually about my own work, and this has already been introduced to you in terms of the idea of a bio-regional economy. And the subtitle of my book is Land, Liberty and the Pursuit of Happiness. And that, I think, establishes clearly why I'm glad to be speaking at this conference today. So what do I mean about the bio-regional economy? It's quite interesting. When I raise this with people, they actually often say, oh, you want to go back to the horse and cart. So I'm a little bit nervous about the Saxon village. But I think where we are sharing an idea is the idea that in order to be free and to be happy, you do need to have access to land to meet your own needs directly. And that's kind of at the heart of my bio-regional proposal. I don't think it would quite be like being in a Saxon village. I mean, technology's moved on, and we also need to claim ownership of the technology that enables us to have lives based on much less physical labour, although a lot more physical labour than most of us do today. Because if you take fossil fuels out of the equation, in order to support our lifestyles, we will have to do a lot more work. Okay, so a bioregional economy, I see it as a globally local proposal, because it's the same proposal for every part of the world. I use this phrase, borrowing your resources from the local natural environment, because rather than relying on global trade to provide for your most basic needs, the suggestion is that as a community you have ownership of your land and you then meet your needs directly from the land. So this automatically gives you firstly a stake in your local place, but it also gives you an incentive to protect the environment, and it makes you accountable for a part of the planet. And we're trying to, not revitalise, renovate or rehabilitate the phrase NIMBY, and we call ourselves Lambies, which is looking after my backyard. Because if everybody looks after their backyard, then eventually the whole world will be looked after. Right. So I think I've made this point. What I'm trying to achieve is the best possible human life within a framework where we look at the kind of energy reductions we need to make to stop causing the problem of climate change, and assuming that there should be global equity. And that really means focusing the economy on quality rather than quantity. So I'll just quickly say a little bit about bioregionalism if you don't know about it. How do we define where we live on the planet? At present, we very often define it in terms of political units that are often the result of wars, very historic. They don't really have much sense of meaning for us. And lots of us live in places like that. Whereas a bioregion is a place that's naturally defined. So maybe in terms of river systems or mountain systems. And quite often you have areas of the country that people do recognise and they do identify with, but they have no political status. So I live in the cheap end of the Cotswolds, actually, but I do live in the Cotswolds. The Cotswolds is an area that's always on the maps, but it doesn't actually have any political meaning. And so it might be a good example of a bioregion. If we apply this idea of bioregions to the economy, then what we're looking for is regions that would acknowledge their ecological limits and would seek to meet as many of their needs as they could from within their own area, and in fact from their own land. So they're seeking self-sufficiency in terms of basic resources and also services. And I use this principle of trade subsidiarity to explain how this might happen, because at this point everybody sort of throws out their hands in horror and says, no more coffee. But it's not like that. It's just that you will start with using stuff that's produced locally. So you might eat a lot more apples and not so many bananas, for example. But it doesn't mean no trade at all. But trade obviously is very energy intensive. So in a world of limited energy, it's something we're going to have to seriously curtail. Context is everything. I have to put this slide in for when I'm talking to people from different cultures anyway. So when my book came out, there was a picture of a load of us on the community farm. And I had this sort of thought that people might think it was like the Cultural Revolution, and all the intellectuals were being sent out to do farming. Because in some contexts, that just doesn't really have the same meaning that it does in Stroud. So it's important to note that when I'm making these proposals, I am suggesting that we very much look at the energy intensity of our lifestyles. But obviously the same proposal doesn't apply in different parts of the world, because large areas of the world are far below their per capita carbon emissions, and also are not obviously at a level of development or quality of life that we would expect if we're thinking about global equity. Okay, so what does this do in terms of the way we think about land? Well, I actually think we can learn a lot from a lot of people who still live very closely to the land. in very close relationship with the land. So Thomas was mentioning we can't, it's hard for us to imagine what it was like in a Saxon village. But actually it might not be that hard if we move to a different part of the planet. It might be difficult in this country, but there are people on the earth who still live in a very similar kind of way, who have communal use-based approaches to land management. Actually, this is an Aboriginal illustration, obviously, and most of the original peoples in Australia have obviously been moved off the land and live in fairly dismal conditions these days. But I think I've learned a lot from their approach, their relationship with land. And if you don't know about the songlines and how they define Aboriginal people's relationship with land, we've got somebody from Australia here, so you obviously know all about this. There's a very good book by Bruce Chatwin about songlines, and I found it absolutely amazing to just get a sense of that close relationship to land, and then also to trace how that might have some kind of vestigial remains in our own country. Anyway, go into that a bit in my book. Okay, so here's a quotation from Kirkpatrick Sale, who's a big proponent of bioregionalism. And he says, in societies whose very existence depended upon knowing the earth and how to hunt its animals and forage its foods, the way we've lived for most of our history, respect for the natural world and appreciation of the land itself as sacred and inviolable was surely inevitable. That sensibility was literally so vital that it was embedded in some central place in each culture's myths and traditions and was embodied in each culture's supreme spirits and deities. And just to conclude now, I'd like to make this point, because I started off by saying something about the scientistic nature of modern economic theory. And I think it's very important to recognise how the way we think about things, not just what we think, not just what we propose in terms of policies, but the very way we think about things actually limits the options that we think are possible. And Mary Midgley, I think, is great in unpicking some of the worst sort of offences of scientism. And she has a great book called Evolution as Religion. And as she says here, our ideas about our place in the world pervade all our thought, along with the imagery that expresses them, constantly determining what questions we ask and what answers seem possible. And so one of the challenges I'm making in my book is to say that the sort of rationalist capitalist model that has developed has led us into all sorts of social and ecological problems, as I've already demonstrated, but also I think is leaving us with a real sense of unfulfillment and a real loss in certain areas of our lives that are important to us as human beings, which I would sort of place in the broadly spiritual domain. And this is a phrase obviously from Max Weber, the disenchantment of the world, and I think he argued that about the Enlightenment and about rationality. And I would like to think that when we think about land in a different way, we're taking some steps towards re-enchanting the world for ourselves and fulfilling ourselves on that deeper level as well. Thank you very much.
Very interesting.
Okay.
Talk, I'm sure we have learned a lot. When have some questions? Yes, go.
Yeah, well, I could make I was very impressed by the bioregional approach. Coming, as I do, as a water engineer, I was absolutely bowled over with the concept of river basin management as being the natural basis for managing the water resource in that sense. And then, of course, with privatisation, we virtually abandoned the idea. But the concept of a natural boundary for a community appeals to me enormously in identifying the natural laws that pertain to each region, and therefore providing a more rational basis for exchanges, for complementing each other. So in that area, I just thought how wonderful that was. So if you'd like to say anything more about bioregional, I would be fascinated. The area that I guess I had most difficulty with what you had to say was the notion that you couldn't take virtually everything good that you had to say into account with natural law. And you make it, you suggest that the current system is rational. I would suggest it's utterly irrational. The notion that the laws that we've devised are because of science, it's because of a misunderstanding of science or of natural law that would seem to me to be the issue. And so I would very much like the opportunity to engage at some time with regard to just to exploring the validity of natural laws as distinct from the rather artificial way in which they happen to have been interpreted.
I'm absolutely with you there, and I use this word scientistic as an alternative to scientific, because economics as it's currently structured is anti-scientific, because it comes from a time before the laws of thermodynamics were determined. And this is why it thinks that it's possible, you know, in economic theory, it's possible to grow forever within a finite universe, because actually economics comes from the 18th century, and the laws of thermodynamics were not discovered until the beginning of the 19th century. And there's a terrific book by Georgescu-Roegen, if you haven't read it, The Economic Process, and what is it? I always forget the name of it.
What was the alternative word you've just used?
Scientistic, which means this kind of sort of almost religious effect, you know, religious attachment to scientific ways of analysing things where it's just not appropriate.
Right.
But in the case of economics, it's actually pre-scientific and hasn't taken on board the changes in science which actually should have changed its basic laws. Just to say, while I'm advertising my book here, I had a big fight with my publisher, who have basically enclosed not even my knowledge, my dreams and visions in this book, and have made it so expensive that nobody can afford to buy it. So if you want to buy it, go to my website, because I have now negotiated a less totally unreasonable price. I think they wanted to charge 30 quid. Who's going to pay 30 quid for a paperback? I think I've got it down to 25 quid now. But if you really want to read it and you can't afford it, then I'm sure we could negotiate something. So I'm negotiating with Alana, aren't I, over this? So I use it as currency as well as knowledge exchange.
Yes.
Yeah, but libraries can't afford to buy books now. Yeah, sadly. That's by far the best way. But I mean, I don't think a library would buy a paperback for 30 quid. But anyway, never mind. If your library wants it, I'll find a way.
Yes.
Can I just say that this, using the word science, has been around a lot longer than thermodynamics and even Adam Smith. But my idea, and it's another of these examples of where a word has been corrupted by repeated use, and to say that just because some model of the economy uses a lot of numbers, an enormous amount of computer manipulation is scientific, is wrong.
No, I agree.
Science is based on knowledge whose truth has been established. And if we stick to that definition, we can say that most of what passes for economic science currently is not science.
I agree. I won't get into debating what science is, but I absolutely agree with you that most economics is not scientific. That's really the point I was wanting to make, yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, feeding on from that, one of the things I'm concerned about is that the labelling of the movement for green economics against science will unfortunately mean that a lot of classical economics, which makes a great deal of sense, will be put in is somehow considered to be out of date and wrong, when in actual fact there's central wisdom in there, fundamental wisdom about how to do the world economically, which green economists could learn an awful lot from, and in particular the distinction between, you know, the three factors of production, one of which is land, and that's, I guess, that's where a lot of us in this room are coming from, and the movement towards sort of the leap towards some kind of spiritual approach, or, you know, all of that stuff kind of means that anything that is analytic, using sharp definitions, gets thrown overboard, and that would be a very unfortunate thing.
That's definitely not what I'm doing. I do a lot of analysis. But I think what you're saying is that we don't want to ignore the insights from classical political economy before it became kind of perverted, and absolutely I agree with you about that. I've written a book called Environment and Economy, where I try to apply the insights from different schools, so from the classical economists and also from the Marxists, to my main concern, which is the economics of the environment. So it's important to remember, though, that the classical political economists were all religious Christian people. So this era of most people having no spiritual commitment at all is fairly recent. So I'm not suggesting that we throw out all rigorous methods of analysis and just sort of go and try and work out what to do at all. But I am saying that as human beings, the spiritual side of us is important as well. And I don't think we're going to be able to preserve the environment and our relationship with it unless we work with mind, body and spirit, those three aspects of ourselves, but not abandoning mind and rationality. I'm not proposing that.
Could I have one follow-up question?
Yeah.
Quickly, I just wondered where rent fits into your understanding of economics. Because one thing I do kind of sense, I mean, I'm sort of familiar with the messaging around building the local economy. I come from Totnes, which has a strong transition towns movement, and the idea that we can sort of create products from our local environment and sell them in the market, whether it's organic lemonade or whatever it might be. Unfortunately, my landlord demands £700 a week for a two-bed house, and it just doesn't cut it. And so the question is, when you're addressing new models of the economy embedded in the local system, and you're not addressing the question of rent, I don't think the economic reality of rent is actually going to trump the vision that you would like.
I agree with you. I mean, I've been involved in the transition movement from the start. I think you said that in introducing me, and I've been involved in the economic process. But one of the things I think that limits what transition is doing is it doesn't want to address the political end of this. So it doesn't address the political economy enough. I'm still working with them and trying to encourage them to do that, actually. But personally, one of the reasons I've done a lot of work in the cooperative economy is that I think there's a solution there to the problem of the extraction of value, unearned value. So that's through not paying labour sufficiently, the difference between exchange value and use value, which comes from the Marxist view, but it's also about earning rent without working for it, which comes from classical political economy. I think both of those are actually distorting in the economy, and this is why I quoted Hazel Henderson saying in a green economy we don't have surplus to provide for people who aren't working and living, to provide for people's elite lifestyles, basically. So that is certainly a part of my argument.
Yes, please.
And I'm a supporter of land value tax, and I have a whole chapter on it in my book, the Green Economics book, anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. I just want to add to the same discussion. I thought your speech was really fantastic, but you probably, with the thing about rationalism and science, there were a lot of people in the room who felt the same thing at the same time, so there would have been. But I just want to add that it's sort of actually already said more or less, but that rationalism and spiritualism are not contradictory to each other. It's a false dichotomy. It's we don't have to become less spiritual to be more. We don't have to be less rational to be more spiritual. That's what I'm trying to say, and I think that is one of the reasons why a lot of people here like the writings of Henry George, is because he can be 100% rational and 100% spiritual at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in agreement about that. There was a very interesting radio programme. Well, it wasn't a very interesting programme, but I found something interesting in it. Steve Jones, the geneticist, was talking about Alfred Russel Wallace and saying how what an amazing guy he was, what a great scientist he was. But suddenly, towards the end of his life, he went totally insane and started taking an interest in spiritualism. So it was like, Anyway, I mean, I'm not a spiritualist, but if I was that much of an admirer of any scientist, I would take everything they'd done equally seriously. I wouldn't say, well, they're 90% brilliant and 10% insane, which seemed to be Steve Jones's position.
We have a last question.
Yes, I want to address three apparent paradoxes in what you said. And the third one I'll put first because you probably can deal with it in a minute. A good friend of mine, ecological economist whom you probably know, Josh Farley, is married to a Brazilian woman and spends lots of time in his second country in Brazil. How in hell did the Brazilians come to the conclusion, particularly with guys like Farley down there frequently, to the position they did? Secondly, what's different about British business schools that you could possibly end up in a business school?
And as a professor, how did I do that? I'm going to tell you how I did that.
Thirdly, is what is unique about Carolyn Lucas's Brighton district that allows her to have succeeded in getting to be an MP?
Okay, those are actually quite easy to answer. I don't know Josh Farley, and the reason for that is I have a no-fly policy, so I've never been to the US. I made an exception to my no-fly policy to go to South America. I flew there, and I came back by ship. So it was, I couldn't go both ways by ship because I just couldn't get enough time off work. So that's in the whole area George Monbiot refers to as love miles. You know, this is one of the things, as we travel more, we create more reasons to travel, and we know people in much more extended networks, which is very problematic in terms of keeping within your carbon allowance. The answer to why they reacted that way is because the Rio +20 economy that was the follow-up to 1992, so it was held in Rio in 2012, green economy had been completely co-opted by the corporate lobbyists to get money going to them to develop the kinds of businesses they were going to make profit from in the same old way. So it was green economy defined without any structural change to how the economy works. And they were rightly very cynical about that. But unfortunately, they didn't realise that I was just as critical as they were. How did I get to be a professor? I'm going to become a professor of green economics. I think I've talked my boss into doing that, and I hope she's not watching the webcast. Because when I first got this job, I was previously a reader in green economics, but they didn't want to make me a professor of green economics. There isn't one in the world yet, so I really want to be the first one. But how did I do that? Actually, what I did was I followed the rules as much as I could, and I was fairly pragmatic about it. I haven't been able to get a job in an economics department, and I think that's quite an important distinction, because a lot of what I do is fairly pragmatic. I work with cooperatives. You know, I do that kind of consultancy work that universities like. I publish in the best journals I can publish in. So, you know, they put the criteria down, I meet them. And then under the law of academic freedom, they can't stop me getting a job. They can't kick me out. Well, not so far. Caroline Lucas, I don't think it's a secret to the party to say that everything was poured into getting an MP elected. Under a first-past-the-post system, when you face such media barriers and you're always treated as not a real party, it's tremendously difficult to get an MP elected, and we just put a huge amount of effort in. But the other side of that is that everybody now uses her as the Green MP. So all the questions that need to be asked, she's asking all of them. So just having a foot in the door there is already making a huge difference. But whether we can get more MPs under such a corrupt political system, we may get a couple more next time, but we just don't have the energy and resources as a party to put that much effort. And the first priority will be keeping somebody at Westminster, because that gives us access to other things that we just couldn't do otherwise.
Well, just quickly, bioregional movement, I also think is very important. I used to live around the corner from Peter Berg in San Francisco 30 or 40 years ago. He was one of the leaders of it there. Proud theory and practice is bioregional. Do you know, but I'm not so much in touch with it now, is there a land mapping? Is there any bioregional maps that also are looking at who owns what land and resources where, or putting value numbers on the land and resources in the bioregion? Do you know anyone doing that?
Australia has 86 bioregions mapped, and they're not used for economic planning, they're used for environmental planning. So that they are the most advanced that I've found out. I think New Zealand's in a similar kind of process. There's some mapping.
Land ownership on them? Land ownership?
That's just in terms of the bioregions now, the sort of biogeographical mapping, that's been done there. Some work on that's been done in California. I don't know, a lot of countries are going through land reform at the moment, so the first part of that process is to work out who owns all the land. I mean, Britain is notoriously way back down the track on that, and that's an ongoing fight, you know, and we should, everywhere we go, we should say that it's outrageous that the most important resource is owned secretly and people are profiting from it without our knowledge. And not only do they profit from the land ownership and not pay anything back in tax, we actually pay them through the Common Agricultural Policy with privilege, completely. But it's not surprising they keep that a secret. And I mean, last week with the royal baby, you know, the Green Party's policy is that you shouldn't have a hereditary principle in government. So you can have the royals as a figurehead. We're not full-on Republicans, but they shouldn't have any role in the constitution. And part of the reason for that is that role of the monarchy relates very closely to the role of the aristocracy, who are still landowners in this country. And 13% of the land apparently belongs to descendants of the Plantagenets, which is just extraordinary, since they lost the throne in 1485. So they may lose political power, but they hang on to their land. And that's the main reason we need to know who owns what. And a third of land is unaccounted for, I think, in this country.
I am afraid we have to stop at them here. I'm sure you will be with us. We are having a break. I want a big applause. I think she's done something very brief, concise, and right to the point. Congratulations on the work you've done.